a big part of what M13 is about community. There's a reason that we use the phrase brighter together. And what that means is that no matter how talented any one of us individual are and the impact that it is, together we can create something greater. And you're going to see some of that in the panel today. But a lot of what we're doing is for the broader community. And what we're going to talk about in this session is how to apply some of these changes and times to create a better community. So before we go into this, I do want to acknowledge some of the people on our broader community who are making such unique and amazing efforts. Many people who are affiliated with M13 know that Virgin and Richard Branson is a big part of M13's extended family. He's done some amazing things that we're proud of, and I want to acknowledge that. Taking this satellite launch company, Virgin Orbit, and being able to pivot on a dime to mass produce ventilators that will help address the shortage that hospitals are seeing. Like, stuff like that is amazing, and puts everything in context, that even in really hard times, there's incredible bright spots that we can all connect to. And I want to make sure that when we're talking about what can be a dark topic, that we do focus on some of the bright spots. So I'm glad we're able to kind of use the time to see the inspiring work that companies, even commercial space companies like Virgin, are being able to adjust to this new environment and do positive things. And that's the spirit that I want to adjust today's conversation to. So we're going to talk about some of the issues that many companies are facing, potentially having to make hard decisions around protecting their organization, protecting their employees, but doing so in a way that keeps to the spirit that Richard and Virgin did, and that's very, very true to M13. We're going to be talking about some of the recent legislative changes around CARES, around FFCRA. We're going to be talking about it from an employment side and from an HR organizational side. With that, I want to actually now take the time, now that we're all connected over audio, to introduce our panels. Or actually let them introduce ourselves. So we have Lynne Hook, who's the co-founder of Employment Lawyer. She's going to be covering a lot of the legal side and the compliance side of all the new changes. And then my friend Emily has been gracious enough to join as well. She's going to talk about how she helps companies think about things around organizational planning, managing your talent, creating engagement, and all the things that you want to do to create the momentum and the high performance and the energy to do these through really dark, potentially uncertain times, all with an eye to a bright spot. So thank you both for joining. I'll let you both kind of introduce a little bit of your background and where you're coming from, and then we'll get into a little bit of panel. So Lynne, do you want to share a little bit of your background and who you are?
Sure. Hello, everyone. So nice to be with you virtually, and thanks to M13 for inviting me to participate. So I've been advising and defending employers in California and U.S. employment matters for over 25 years. I help human resources and operations on the legal aspects of employment policies. I conduct training and investigations. And I have to say, as a long-term employment lawyer, I have not worked on a layoff RIF for over 10 years. So this is very unusual times. Many of our younger business partners they don't even know what the acronym RIF stands for, yeah, which is wonderful. And now we're all unfortunately getting to be much more aware of it. So thank you.
Cool. And then Emily, do you want to share your background?
Sure. So I'm Emily Chardac. I'm based in Chicago. So thank you, Matt and M13, for having me. I've been practicing HR for 15 years. When I was entering the workforce, we were in the thick of the recession in 2008. So I'm starting to feel like we're getting a bit back into those days. I spent a good time in Silicon Valley working in tech companies, building various companies through IPO, and most recently at one of the largest investment banks in the world. So now I have the privilege to go back into my tech roots and help companies grow and scale, and unfortunately deal with things like what we're talking about today.
That's right. Thank you both. So between me in New York, Emily in Chicago, and Lynne in LA, we've blanketed the country. What's interesting for this topic, and Lynne, you can kind of talk a little about this, is traditionally a lot of the issues around employment law are very state and local specific, because that's where a lot of the guidance comes from. But with some of the new changes, it's actually coming from the top down. So there's not as many unique situations to city with a lot of the guidance. Lynne, I'd love kind of your perspective talking about that and what that means for companies regardless of where they are.
Sure. So today is April 1st, April Fool's Day, but we're in a strange world where federal rules and federal support benefits are actually preempting a lot of state rules right now. That never happens, but we are in an unusual place, and the federal government is certainly coming up with many wonderful plans to assist employers and employees and try to keep the economy moving forward. We are going to touch on some New York and California issues, of course, but we're primarily going to focus on the federal guidance right now. Traditionally, state benefits come first and everything else follows, but we're in a little bit of a different place right now, particularly if you're an employer with less than 500 employees, which I understand most of your participants on this webinar would be. So we'll clarify that as we go along. And then the CARES Act and its effect on unemployment is going to be a dramatic shot in the arm for employees across the United States and will impact state governments' availabilities and possibilities of supporting U.S. workers. So we'll cover that. That's great. And just for the people in the audience, where we're going to do this is Lynne, Emily, and I are going to talk for probably the first 20 or 30 minutes of the broadcast, and then we'll open it up to broader questions. So you should be able to add questions in the bottom part of your screen, but we really want to try to make this as interactive as possible. So please do ask some questions if we don't cover it. Speaking with that, Lynne, given some of the changes and some of the confusion and all of the questions and anxiety that just everyone is dealing with right now, what to you are some of the, from a high level at least, what are the most important things that companies you're working with or companies on this call should be thinking about, what they should be doing, how they interact with others? What are the information that's most important for them to know? Sure. So today, the Federal Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act goes into effect and provides 80 additional hours of paid sick leave for any U.S. employer with less than 500 employees. Part-time workers are also included in this figure, and this is a very unusual situation because this type of leave preempts and is paid prior to any other type of paid leave. It preempts PTO, state paid sick time, whatever it might be. And this leave is available immediately to employees. There's no wait period in this addition to any other leave your employer might provide to you. So there's 6 reasons laid out on the Department of Labor website if you want to go there for more information. Basically, it's relating to quarantines and isolation orders and healthcare provider quarantines, whether you're caring for an individual subject, not a family member, and any individual, if you happen to have caregiving responsibilities for someone who is under isolation or quarantine orders, whether you're caring for a child because your child's childcare or school is closed, or any other substantially similar condition. So if you're able to telework your normal schedule, but you occasionally need hours for childcare, paid sick leave can be used intermittently, which is great news. So I have a lot of employers asking me, well, my employee can only work 4 hours a day, or I know she really can't work 8 hours a day. I know she's only working 4 hours a day because she has a 6-year-old at home, or she has 4 children at home, or whatever it might be. So you can work out an arrangement whereby that particular employee is receiving emergency paid sick leave benefits while still accomplishing part of her job via telework. So that is part of the equation there. It's being paid out at the higher minimum wage or the regular rate of pay, which I won't go into all those details. It's a maximum of $511 a day or $51.10 in the aggregate. But the reasons 4 through 6, which is caregiving and childcare, that's a slightly lower rate. It's about 2/3 of pay. So the Act is providing quarterly tax credits for employers to cover these benefits, and those credits are going to be allowed against your portion of Social Security taxes. So an example of this is, let's say you paid out $5,000 in paid sick leave this week or next week, and you're otherwise required to deposit $8,000 in payroll taxes. The IRS is telling us you're going to use that $5,000 of your $8,000 tax that you were going to deposit, and you're only going to deposit the remaining $3,000. Conversely, if you actually are paying out more in paid sick leave than you would in your Social Security required deposit, then you're going to make a request for an accelerated credit for the remaining amount. So the federal government is funding this emergency paid sick leave. And the second part of it I'll just touch on briefly is the Emergency Family Medical Leave Expansion Act. That's up to 12 weeks of childcare leave starting today through the end of the year. And the employee is going to be eligible for that if they've been with you for at least 30 days. Again, a much broader eligibility factor than under traditional FMLA. If that employee is unable to work or telework because they have to care for their child under the age of 18, or their child care has been closed or whatever it might be due to some kind of the public health emergency that most states are engaged in right now, they are entitled to these 12 weeks. So a lot of details floating around out there. Again, details available on the Department of Labor website. Lots of resources you're getting probably from your local Chamber of Commerce, and you're all getting inundated with emails. But just know that those benefits are available from the federal government starting today.
So I want to ask you, I'm going to pivot to Emily for a second, but I want to come back in terms of, it seems like so much information. How do you decide what to focus on first? How do you decide what to do first? Emily, I'm curious from your perspective, from the companies you're talking to or what you're seeing, what are the biggest questions that they're having, or what are they focusing on first and foremost right now when it comes to managing their organization from an employee side?
Yeah, from an employee side, we're getting a lot of questions on childcare support. How do you balance schedules, work norms, this kind of thing. And then, dealing with or managing mental health and anxiety related reactions to the situation at hand. And so I wouldn't say the questions have been around, can I take extended time off? So far, it's been, how do I deal with this? Mm-hmm. Employers are being pretty lenient and accommodating to help people think through those issues or situations people are navigating.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I see is very similar to that, right? At a time like this, everybody needs to kind of hunker down and focus. And I think everyone realizes that, these are the crucible moments that build an organization. And there's something really kind of calming in a time of anxiety to have that North Star to focus on, and people want to do that. At the same time, what we're seeing is, or what we're hoping that employers are doing or should be doing, is creating that safe space to recognize that people are going through unprecedented times, right? And so how do you give them, how do you make sure that you're focused on driving the business in a way where it's more critical than ever, but doing so in a way where you're getting the best out of your employees long-term, and recognizing that there's no playbook for dealing with this. And, people are overly anxious. So we'll talk about a little bit later in it about how you kind of provide comfort and communication to drive that, but recognizing that and giving people that flexibility is so important, both for legal reasons and for long-term organizational performance reasons. Lynn, for things like that, what are the places where companies can start when they have questions, or they have ambiguity about how to manage? They don't know, can we even do this? Do we run into this? Do we what's the legal perspective that you would provide from a prioritization perspective?
Mm-hmm. So most employers are dealing with the idea of employees who have reduced wages right now for a variety of reasons. Maybe they're working a partial schedule due to childcare issues. So most states, I'll just touch on California, we have partial unemployment benefits up to 26 weeks. And the employer is required to complete a form. It's the DE 2063 Notice of Reduced Earnings. And once the employee then submits that to EDD, they are eligible for the weekly benefit up to $450, depending on their wages. Now, this was designed really for lower wage earners. So many employees may not see much relief there. However, the CARES Act that we've talked about, this is adding a sum of whatever benefit would be provided at the state level, plus $600 from the government, and an extension of 13 weeks of benefits. So many employers are asking me about these unemployment rules, and it is important that you are helping your employees find those resources and try to identify how to obtain those employment resources, even if they're underemployed or they're reduced schedule. Also be aware that many states are actually mandating that employers start to file unemployment requests on behalf of their employees. So do be sure you are checking in with your state unemployment website, and you're looking at what your obligations are as an employer, no matter where you're doing business. And this is even if you have remote employees. Your remote employees are going to receive their unemployment from the state they actually work in. So even if you're a California-based employer, if you have 5 employees working out of Texas, those employees have to seek Texas benefits for unemployment. So it gets pretty complicated.
That's right. I want to put in a standard disclaimer, and Lynn kind of check me in this, that we're talking about legal issues at a high level. These may not apply to every person, and you obviously and absolutely should check individually with your attorney, whether it's Lynn or someone else afterwards. We're going to give the best advice we can in as broad a way, but it is not intended specifically for every situation. So consider that the fine print. We'll move on from there, but I did want to make sure that we're getting that out there. I want to move on. A lot of people are having, and you raised this yourself, Lynn, companies thinking about, do I need to do layoffs? Am I better off doing furloughs? Should I do a RIF? And I'll let you explain specifically what that stands for people who don't know. And the equation has changed dramatically with some of this legislation about what is the right thing to do. So I'd love your perspective about when to think about those different things, what they mean. And then Emily, you can talk about what you're seeing some of the companies do as well around those different options for workforce management when revenues are dropping dramatically.
Sure. A lot of confusion about the idea, Marriott and Virgin and Delta came out announcing that they were going to be furloughing tens of thousands of employees, sidelining them without pay, but keeping them on the payroll. So furlough is a concept that we don't typically use in employment law language. It's typically a collective bargaining and union environment type of term. But a mandatory furlough is a suspension from work without pay. It could be as brief or as long as the employer wants. It could mean that you're telling your employee that they can only work 4 hours a day, or that you only want them working on Mondays and Fridays. It could be that you're going to tell them you need them to take 10 days off and you have no work for them for 10 days. It could be a lot longer. And the important thing to keep in mind in California is our state labor commissioner considers a furlough of more than 10 days to be a termination. So it's important in those instances to remember that you are treating the employee as if their position has been terminated due to the inability to provide work. And then you would issue their final PTO if they have any, and you would want to kind of free them up to get whatever unemployment benefits they need. You do need to give them a letter explaining why you're taking the action you're doing generally, that it's related to COVID-19, and that they are not going to be offered hours for a particular period of time, because they're going to use that to supplement their EDD filing or their unemployment filing. Remember, a furloughed employee cannot do any work whatsoever when they are not being paid. So you need to be very clear, if you're reducing schedules, what your expectations are of those employees. They can't take phone calls or answer emails while they're on furlough. If it's a salaried employee, remember the exempt rules are pretty strict with exempt employees. They're generally paid by the week. So even if they do a couple days of work, they're getting paid for the week unless you have a clear furlough plan in place with them where you are expecting that let's say they're only doing 50% of their job for 50% of salary, something along those lines. So just keep in mind whether you do want to set that expectation that they're coming back to work, or whether you need to be realistic and figure out, will they not be able to come back to work right now, but I will keep in touch with them down the road. It is confusing. A layoff is the term we typically use in California and in most other places. That means we don't have funds to pay you, or we don't have work to give you. It could be temporary, it can be permanent. There's not much practical difference, to be honest. Again, California requires that you pay out PTO. And as far as healthcare coverage, if you stop paying for healthcare coverage for that worker who's laid off or furloughed, they are eligible for COBRA. So they do have the option to go on to COBRA, and you need to make sure they're getting that paperwork and that communication.
Do benefits apply differently for a layoff versus a furlough situation?
Yes, and it's really important that you check your plan, because your plan might say that if an employee is not actively working for a particular period of time, that they lose eligibility. So you can potentially revise the plan during this crisis, but it's important to work with your broker to figure out what you can continue to offer to those workers. Typically, an employee who is active on the payroll is eligible. An employee who is inactive and not on a covered leave of absence is usually ineligible. So you just need to make sure you cover those items.
Yeah, and I would add to this, since this is a healthcare pandemic, short-term disability and long-term disability can be gravely impacted if somebody's on furlough. So it's something to think about.
Yes. And I mentioned before the reduction in force. This is what we call the RIF, that none of you younger, lovely workers have heard of, thank goodness. But, you know, we went through a lot of RIFs back in 2008, 2009. This is when the position is eliminated and you have no intention of returning that headcount. So if you are reducing the workforce due to your business downturn, this is a RIF. And this is something where you use neutral factors. You're typically going to offer some sort of severance pay. I think Emily's going to cover some of these topics as we go along. I will just point out a lot of employers are asking me about WARN Act or CalWARN or State WARN. WARN stands for the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. And it's a concept where we give employees 60 days notice of an impending closure or mass layoff so they can prepare themselves financially for the hit that's coming. Typically under federal law, when you have an unforeseen business circumstance, such as this is, WARN Act is not applicable. And it only applies, I get a lot of questions about this, it only applies when you are laying off at least 50 employees in a 30-day window at one work site. So if you're laying off 5 employees here, 5 employees in San Francisco, 5 employees in Chicago, 5 employees in Atlanta, it's not going to cover you. You don't need to worry about WARN Act. But you do want to consult your state website for any counterparts to federal WARN.
If organizations are trying to decide which of those is the right approach for them, especially given some of the stimulus loans that might be in place, what's the best advice that we can give them during this time?
That's a good question. You know, many of the stimulus loans, there are benefits to keeping much of your workforce intact. Some of the small business loans that are coming out mean you have to retain at least 90% of your employees to the extent practicable to have forgiveness on some of these loans. So you do want to work with whatever the Small Business Administration is offering. If you're a larger business, you want to keep in mind that it's always going to be best to try to keep your workforce intact. But you have to make tough decisions about economic requirements. We usually talk about last in, first out, where maybe you just decide that anyone hired in the last 30, 40, 50 days is going to be reduced. Typically using those more neutral factors such as seniority is the best way to go about those RIFs or those reductions.
And talk about why, and then Emily, I want your perspective on that too, just for the audience to understand why that's a thing.
Yes. Seniority is a neutral factor. It does not take into account race, age, gender, disability. It is simply you were one of the last ones hired by this company when we thought the outlook was rosy. The outlook is now looking very different. So I've been working in the last 24 hours with a tech company in San Francisco to help them do a quick layoff. And things are changing daily. You know, as of yesterday, they were laying off 10 people. Today, I'm hearing they're up to 25. So they're making quick adjustments and they're trying to decide what the best method is for their workers while trying to keep as many working from home as possible.
Yeah, and I was going to say I don't have much more to add other than it's a very neutral message, like Lynne was saying, to employees. It's something that can be easily swallowed. In a lot of, at least in tech, when you're in growth mode or you're in one of those hockey puck growth trajectories, it's again an easier message to say we're going back to our roots, we're dialing back where we were the last 6 months, so we're really trying to pull back.
That's right. Yeah.
And this happened so quickly. You know, honestly, I mean, 3 weeks ago, maybe reading the crystal ball, we should have known this was coming 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago. But I'll give you a personal example. I ran a 5K with a pastor of my church 1 month ago today. he is now suffering from the virus and is in the hospital. So this happens so fast. It is just something that employees understand, that employers are trying to adjust as quickly as possible. But the compassion element is really important, and that's what Emily is going to touch on.
Yeah, I wanna go into that a little, just because we talked about it. When we think about ways to plan for this, right? Doing in a way where you can make decisions quickly but thoughtfully, so that you don't have to keep kind of going back and changing it. Thinking about how to take into consideration communication issues, performance issues, issues around adverse impact with gender, with race. What are some things before you get to this point, right? Obviously, the best time to be thoughtful about these type of decisions is 6 months ago, right? The next best time is right now. So for companies that are trying to plan for the future, what are some things and best practices that they hopefully have in place so that when they have to make these tough decisions, they can do so in a fair and equitable and also legally justifiable way? And talk a little bit about that from your perspective, Emily.
There's some great content being circulated and open sourced right now, specifically playbooks that help companies think through business continuity plans, workforce planning. This is a way to be loud and proud on how you're thinking through these types of issues, and quite frankly, to be transparently consistent how you're thinking of them. One of the things I've been advising companies is to come up with a scorecard. It's a binary numeric way to look at the data from a meta perspective. You can take names off, so it's not about the person, but it can be about tenure. It could be about location. There's just a variety of ways that you can be very neutral and fair in how you're decisioning these types of things. And then, one of the things that's come up quite a lot, and maybe we shouldn't be surprised by this, is there have been a few companies that have said, oh, great, we can get rid of our low performers.
Yeah.
And I said, that doesn't count, right? So
Right.
That's been,
and that's exactly why
to recoach.
You don't want to do this at the last minute, right? And this is
No.
why you hear from your HR teams, leaders and founders and CEOs in the call, that having a regular cadence of candid, transparent, and honest performance feedback all the time is so important, right? And it can be really lightweight, but if you do, you should always be managing performance. The best time to manage performance is not right now, because it actually makes it harder at times to manage your workforce. One, it just feels much more emotionally fraught, and two, there's a lot of legal considerations where if you have a really good cadence around that, you can do it. So continually working with your teams to give feedback and to let people know where they stand actually gives you the data over time to create those scorecards in a way where you do have a history and a trail on it, right? And can do it in a way where it does feel authentic. Being really open and where people are, all the more important, right?
Yeah, I always explain to employers that they'll tell me they're going to let someone go and it's a performance-based determination. So I say, well, send me the personnel file or send me whatever documentation. Oh, we don't have anything documented. It's just, it's been going on for months. And I say, well, if it's not in black and white, it didn't happen. So, you got to make sure you're keeping track of those emails and recording those discussions. And obviously, yes, now is not the time to be focused on performance. Typically, I ask employers to provide me a spreadsheet of all employees in a department or a specific section, being like, let's say, like Emily mentioned, if you're going to shut down a particular office, I want to see all employees employed at that office. I would like to see all protected characteristics. I want to see race, age, disability issues, workers' comp claims, last performance score. And then I look at it holistically and I slice and dice the data to see, okay, so you chose these 5 employees to let go. Let me make sure, I don't want their names. I don't need to know anything I don't need to know who they are. I just want to make sure that it's defensible, the decisions you made. And if it's purely based on seniority, no problem at all. If it's purely based on, everyone at a particular location is going, no problem. If an entire department is being let go, got it. But, once we start digging into, well, we chose this one and this one. Yeah, he's over 40. Yes, she has a disability. That's when it gets a little bit more complicated. And I've been having lots of those discussions with employers.
Yeah, one of the things that people like Emily and I will always say to the companies we're working with is that no one should ever, under normal circumstances, right? Nobody should ever be surprised to be fired. And there's reasons why we want to create a culture and why it's so important to create a culture of feedback. The most important one remains that that's actually how you drive performance, right? By setting clear goals and giving people regular feedback about where they're doing amazingly and where they're falling short. That's just a good way to drive engagement performance. In situations like this, it actually adds another layer of complexity because it does create issues around this as well. So that feedback is so important. Mm-hmm. Going back to some of the other planning, what are the other things that people should be planning if they do have to make those reductions? What about employees or children, employees who have children or sick parents that they're giving for? How do you apply issues around PTO to that? What are some other things that employers should be thinking about, Lynn, when transitioning through their organization through this change?
Sure. Well, some employers are asking me, well, do they make more on unemployment than they will working? I say, well, yes, but that's not really the adjustment we want to be making. Typically, now under our current environment, a California employee could be eligible for $1,050 a week in unemployment benefits. That is the maximum with the federal stimulus. Under paid family leave or state disability, they get about 60% of their wages, up to about $1,300 a week. So you have to look at the various options, and really filing a claim for paid family leave or disability is typically going to render a larger payment to that higher earning employee. But the partial unemployment plan is there, the full unemployment is there. Every state is going to have the stimulus added to that. You want to think about if you're less than 500 employees, you're going to be applying emergency paid sick time. If you're over that level, or they exhaust their emergency paid sick time, remember that paid sick time is not paid out at termination. So if you have an employee who has to take care of children in the interim, or has some kind of family member with an illness or a personal illness, whether it be COVID related or not, you want them to use that paid sick time first, because that's not going to be paid out at termination. Unlike PTO, what they're going to get at termination in California regardless. So think about how you can best kind of puzzle together these benefits to help those employees survive. The only portion that's going to be federally paid is what I covered first. That's going to be the emergency paid sick leave and the emergency FMLA. Those are going to be federal reimbursements. Oh, Matt, I think are you on mute? We might have lost you.
Sorry about that. That was me. I do want to transition a little bit to make sure that we have time for questions to how we're thinking about the rest of the organization. So Emily, when you think about some of the basics of going through situations like this, what are the checklist items and most important thing from a culture, from an operations that companies should be thinking about when making transitions like this?
Yeah, it might be obvious, but first and foremost, there is a person with a life on the other side of these conversations. You cannot undo these conversations, and many times there's irreversible cultural impact to these types of decisions.
And employer brand also, right?
100%. So it's really kind of a nail in the coffin, if I dare say that. So reduction in force and layoffs, or redundancies is the term used outside of the United States. They should really be the absolutely last resort that you make. Some of the advice that I've been giving employers is, Lynn would say this all day, every day if she could, but employers have the duty of care and the burden to prove that there was no funny business in these types of decisions. It is always the employer's burden to prove. So when you're working through these decisions, it's important to be working with an attorney. Even though I've worked in HR on the line of employment law, I certainly am not licensed to practice and advise. And so first and foremost, I strongly recommend having a counsel on your side to help decision these types of issues. Any types of levers that I've been helping companies through are any number of things. I've been advising to come up with modular ways to pull levers. So it could be, take a look at vacation balances. You can't take it away, but you can ask people to use a day a week or 2 days a week, 3 days a week to start draining that financial liability month over month. You do, as Lynn said, you have to pay it out if there's a termination or layoff. So that's one financial lever. I generally recommend pay cuts are also one of the last resorts, just because that's really a hard message to take through. Furloughs or paid types of leaves are helpful if your company's been looking at doing an unpaid sabbatical to go write your book or something like that. That's one option that employers have been thinking about. I'm just trying to see what else. Oh, and messaging. This is so important. We've been seeing this throughout LinkedIn and other social media channels, but we are in this together. This is a really important message that if you're consistently making decisions across the board, we are in this together. And that really helps people think through what it means for them if they're being equally treated with the rest of the team.
Yeah. I want to pause there because I think that's a good one. I'd love Lynn's perspective. Communication is so important. One of the things we know is that in times of uncertainty and anxiety, you cannot over communicate enough. And that goes double when your team is remote, right? Communication just becomes exponentially more important. And you want to do so with transparency. You want to do so with honesty, integrity, with empathy. When having these hard conversations where you may not either know all the facts or you're having these kind of difficult conversations, what are the best ways to communicate what's going on and how the decisions are made to your team? We've talked about wanting to do it fairly but quickly so you don't have to drag it on. We've talked about why it's important to do it with empathy. Lynn and Emily, what are some best practices that you've seen or you advise for companies that are going through this and how they communicate it to their teams?
Yeah, you definitely want to have a script because these are emotional conversations. You do not know how the person is going to react on the other side. We have the added confusion right now that these communications are going to be remote. Typically, you're sitting in a room and you have a HR witness with you, or you've got someone else with you to have the conversation. Now you're going to be over a phone line or a Zoom line, and employees are not going to react well. It's going to be difficult for everybody involved. So having a script is so important, and not necessarily expressing sadness, but expressing empathy and compassion about the situation and explaining how the decision was made, and having a kind of a simple, straightforward explanation for how this tough call was decided by the CEO or whoever the leadership team, and being supportive, like we are willing to send a courier to come pick up your electronic items rather than having you schlep it to a FedEx, or we are willing to provide you with some outplacement services or whatever it might be. So thinking about, because once you terminate, keep in mind all those benefits like emergency paid sick leave, emergency family leave, those are all off the table. Those are no longer available once you are not employed. You're now only looking at unemployment. So unemployment is going to be overburdened, to say the least. I don't know how our state unemployment agencies are going to handle the massive influx and great capacity coming into their doors. Or their websites right now. But when you lay someone off, you close off all those other options, and they are now looking at unemployment. That's pretty much the only option.
Anything you'd add, Emily, on the communication side?
I've been using a coaching technique to say, your pressure test is to evaluate what are you going to regret saying today in the future. Mm-hmm. Don't overpromise, don't overstate. It's a really fine balance to show empathy or how freaked out you are right now with trying to speak the facts. So the advice I've been giving is speak plainly, speak directly, speak simply, less is more. And again, it might be obvious, but there's literally nobody in the world who knows what's going to happen. So today's not the day to pretend that we have all the answers, because we don't. And so just being consistent with those things, I think, has really helped, at least the companies I'm work with, get those messages across the line. And you want to show empathy. I mean, you don't want to be a robot in these types of things, but certainly it reduces the emotional reactions to those communications.
I think that's right. And one of the best practices that we've seen or that we know is that you're better off going deeper, quicker than you might think, to Lynne's earlier point, because you don't want to continue to have these conversations. You want to be able to create some level of certainty, and I hate to use this word for the survivors, so that they know kind of where they stand, right? And doing that at a time where there is so much uncertainty is harder to do. But creating that level of kind of, this is where we are, we're resetting. Emily, I loved kind of the analogy. We're going back to where we were maybe a year or two ago in our journey, but now we're all in this together, so that you can rally the team, give them the space to grieve, recognize what they're, but drive them forward. It is so important. And giving that level of certainty as much as you can in an uncertain world is really important for the people who you need to retain and keep.
And when I just want to touch on severance. We didn't really talk about severance. There's a lot of confusion about whether or not severance is legally mandated, and it is not, unless you have a severance plan that your company has adopted. If you don't have a severance plan, severance is optional. The reason you pay severance is to get a release of claims. And so you have to work with an employment attorney to make sure you have an appropriate release of claims. And then one other point I want to drive home is, under the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, the Older Worker Benefit Protection Act requires that when you do a group exit, you have to allow 45 days to consider the severance agreement. And there's an attachment that's very detailed that has to be included in all severance agreements, or your age discrimination waiver is not valid for anybody over 40. So it's just important that when you're thinking about severance, I have clients that do 1 week per year of service. I have a client right now that's going to do 4 weeks for everybody, whether they've been there 3 months or 3 years. Again, just equivalency is important. Don't cut people out of severance. Don't leave out 1 or 2 females, an individual. I have a client right now that has a demand letter because the 2 employees that didn't get offered severance, one was pregnant and about to go out on maternity leave, and she didn't get it because she was only there 5 months. And their plan that they cobbled together was 6 months or more. So give everybody something. Be fair to everyone. Treat it equitably. It doesn't have to be a lot of money, but severance is always appreciated.
Yeah. And that speaks to your earlier point, for when you're making any decisions right now around employment issues or employment status, create that data. Make sure that you're having an external person, whether it's your HR lead, your employment attorney, look at those things and protected characteristics to make sure that you're applying as fairly and as amicably as possible. I want to pause and open it up to questions. I want to remind people in the audience that we have a question box where you can both ask questions and upvote. I'm going to take a question that somebody sent to me over email to beginning. Lynne, this is a question for you, and if we don't know the answer either, it's unclear, that's totally fine. The person is asking a question about unemployment and some of the other benefits for brand new employees, right? So if someone was just recently hired, say within the first couple of weeks, are they eligible for unemployment if they're being furloughed or laid off? And similarly, if they're new and they came from another state, how would they think about unemployment issues in that way?
Sure, that's a great question. Your unemployment is based upon your work history. So California looks back, for example, and most states do this. They look back to see what your wages were in the last several quarters. And they base your payment on that. So I can't give you specific answers, but yes, if you have work history over the last several years, no matter what state it's in, you might have to apply out of state. If your work history is all in Wyoming, then you should apply for unemployment benefits in Wyoming. And unemployment means you are actively looking for a job. You are available to work. So you want to look at your state options if you've been working out of state.
But work history transfers between companies if necessary, correct?
Yes. So it is important. Now, I will point out one really nice feature of the CARES Act is there is a 3-component unemployment bump. The first component is an extra $600 for all workers through the state paid unemployment process. And that's for those who already qualify for unemployment. Now, there is a pandemic unemployment assistance program, which is really unique. And this is what it matches state normal unemployment rates for those workers who are perhaps previously self-employed. Maybe they didn't qualify for unemployment benefits because they were an independent contractor. So for a lot of those gig economy employees, they don't have a work history. So when EDD looks backwards at your work wages, they're not going to find anything because you are an independent contractor. But under the pandemic assistance from the federal government, under the CARES Act, you will also be eligible for that $600 a week of unemployment.
And the related question that we got is if people are moving from full-time to part-time and are getting reduced in salary, reduced hours, are they eligible for employment? Are there any benefits that are available to them or to the companies for reduced loss of wages due to that?
Yes. So that is where you would file for a partial unemployment claim, and that is different by every state. Every state's going to have their own materials, but when the employee files the claim, which typically happens by the employee, but some employers are actually now requiring employers to do this, you would certify how many hours you were working previously, how many hours you're working at present, and then the state would assess whether or not you're entitled to any benefits. I will say this typically only helps lower wage income workers because the benefit level is fairly low.
Got it. One of the questions that are coming into the panel is somebody's asking, and this may not be related, but if you have a point of view, it would be great. A lot of the new alleviation acts are helping kind of cover for expenses related to utilities. Do you have a perspective on whether that's traditional utilities or are things like cloud infrastructure, like Amazon Web Services or DigitalOcean? Would they be eligible for some of the utilities under PPP, or is it more the traditional things like electricity, phone, et cetera?
I think it's pretty broad-based from what I've read. You as a small business, you can apply for multiple forms of assistance right now. You might have one application out for Paycheck Protection, and you might have another loan application out to cover things like utilities. So be going to the state, the Small Business Administration website to look at all your options because there are multiple loans available right now.
And that's great, thanks. And then another question from Michael online is, where companies where every employee earns over 100K, how would you calculate the average monthly payroll amount for Paycheck Protection?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know that I can do that during this webinar brief time, but basically the Paycheck Protection is loans up to $100,000. This doesn't include federal paid sick or family leave wages for small businesses, nonprofits, independent contractors. I'm not 100% sure how they're going to be calculating all that, but what I've read is it's basically available up to $100,000 per loan.
That's great. Emily, we have a question from Matt about some of the things you've seen about how companies are supporting any creative ways their organizations through these unprecedented times for parents who have to deal with childcare. Are there any unique kind of benefits or services they're offering? Matt suggested, which I love, and maybe we might do here, about companies that create like story time for children or things like that. What have you seen for companies just helping manage through these unprecedented times to drive performance, drive engagement, drive retention?
Yeah, I myself have 3, and I'm totally feeling that too with the homeschooling and the 3-year-old. The creative things that I've seen are you cannot do it all. Like, we can't continue our old life and the new one. So we've been integrating as much as we can. Bring your kids and your pets onto the video. If there's background noise, so be it. We've been supportive of alternative work schedules. If you want to do a 2 or 3 hours sprint, take a break, do it again, take a break. That said, there's an unintended impact to parents working nights and weekends to get their work done, which is exhaustion and burnout and stress. And so the advice that I've been giving is focus on what can get done in the day versus what's not going to get done. There's an awful lot that's not going to get done right now. So I'm a big fan of the book Positive Intelligence. When we focus on that top 20% of the things that need to get done, those are the things that have the greatest impact on the company. And so far that seems to be working. I don't know if that'll continue to work over 6 months' time, but those are a few of the creative ways we've been helping parents through this particular situation.
And you raise such a good point. One of the things we're seeing as well is that companies, especially those who've been through workforce reductions and now are asking the rest of their team to do more with fewer organizational resources, where stress and burnout can be a real issue, especially in a time of heightened anxiety. So providing space for self-care, both physical and mental, is incredibly important. Making sure that they have access to mental health and coaching resources, even more important now than it was before. And it was pretty important before for companies moving at a rapid pace. There are some amazing companies or some amazing startups that specialize in providing mental health and coaching options remotely and over video. And those are good things to work on to make sure that you're supporting your organization that's remaining, that company should look at as well. We've got 5 minutes left. If there's one final closing takeaway that the both of you want to make sure that people think about or come away with, what would that be for each of you?
Well, I guess for me, I would just say, take a deep breath. I feel like we're all forgetting to breathe these days, and we're all kind of up late answering emails and getting up early, panic with thoughts running through our minds. So take a deep breath, and it's most important to remember your health and your family, and keep in mind that, everyone's got the same worries and the same concerns, and really try to just piece through the information that is provided for you by the governments. I would rely on state and federal websites right now for the best information. That's where you're going to get your best details of exactly how things work. And, just again, try to keep in mind that everybody is in a stressful place right now, and we just want to try to manage as competently and compassionately as possible.
That's great. Emily, I'll give you the last word.
I would say two things. Find ways to do more with less, and create a schedule with routine norms and stick to it. And really keenly focus on, it sounds a bit weird, but it's a privilege for people to have access to you. So if there's ways you can create boundaries in your routine and schedule, and even roommates or housemates or family who's living with you, you might need to hide in the bathroom and take a bath too. And this is really important for self-care, because it's best that in all these different facets of our life that people get the best of us and not parts of us. Because if we're halfway in it, all of us working in people-facing roles, those companies won't get the best of our advice and capabilities.